term embodiment is a concept that exists in both philosophical and psychological study. In short, it's used to refer to the study of having a body, which might seem silly. But in cognitive psychology, there's a lot to be considered in how our minds process our bones and muscles. Embodied cognition lets us, in most cases, move without conscious thought, or to translate sensations like hot and cold with ease. We can rely on the synergy between our senses and grey matter to navigate our daily lives. But there is a consideration to be made with regards to how we perceive it, on whether we believe we have a body, or we are a body. Are we, in our essence and personhood, made up of neurons and transmitters housed completely within our minds as we pilot our bodies, so to speak? Or does our matter, our sinew and skin, coalesce with our internal monologues, desires, and disorders to make a complete whole of who we are? I'd be inclined to say the latter. I find it difficult to separate physical sensation from who we are. The nature-nurture debate generally falls somewhere in the centre, and as such, our experiences make up a notable proportion of what we are. Experiences that are lived through eyes, ears, and tongues. To me, the meat suit that I march around in is a vehicle for exploration and growth. I do not know what I would do without it, but I know that I would be different. I'd like to talk about embodiment, about our appearance and identity, and how we need our anatomy to externally, and arguably internally, create a sense of who we are. But what I really want to talk about is the stories we tell. The terrible ones. Stories of change and corruption to our physicality, where our bodies are betrayed and we are robbed of ourself, and how the loss of our physical form is a reflection of the death of our sense of self. When we write of body horror, the introduction of the unworldly or ineffable is what triggers the change. Often, but not always, the antagonistic force of complete unfamiliarity is something that is alien. Visceral Games released Dead Space in 2008, and the game holds no pretense about its inspiration. It wears it entirely on its sleeve. The USG Ishimura's utilitarian hallways devoid of personality could be transposed onto the alien's Nostromo. The science fiction presented in both are not fantastical or extravagant. The ships are not city-sized interstellar stations or graceful starfighters. They are a mining rig and a freight ship. Vessels of purpose. And as with the aesthetic, Dead Space and Alien also share a commonality in their antagonist. Both are ruthless and upsetting assaults on their crew, using vents and speared appendages to dispatch their prey. The alien has become an icon of science fiction. Its tail and inner jaw, its eyeless head, and its intentional lack of personality have cemented it as a prime example of what sci-fi horror is built on. The fear of the unknown, of the thing that is not us, of the other. Tails and teeth that kill are not the most jarring element of the alien, though. The most terrifying thing is in its conception, not in the formulation of it as an idea, in its literal, sexual conception. The facehugger, while nowhere near as threatening, is as iconic to the franchise as its descendant. The forcible impregnation of a non-human entity that climaxes in the chestburster erupting into a world of blood and screams is terrifying, not necessarily due to the blood and gore, but in the non-consensual use of our bodies for its gain. Dead Space does not have chestbursters or facehuggers. The threats Isaac Clarke faces are the necromorphs, zombified corpses that have been mangled and distorted horrifically. Their arms are reshaped into spearheads and their mouths hang open bloodied, and there is no misconception that these things are human. The person they were is no more. The crew of the Ishimura are dead, and their corpses have been reclaimed. In this instance, the mind and soul have been extinguished and expunged. The personality of their crew is evident only in audio logs, as the body of who they once were have been stripped of their self-expression. The basic necromorphs look nearly indistinguishable, varying really only in clothing and fortitude. The cynic will tell you that this is a result of developmental constraints. but I think the team at Visceral accidentally created a diegetic reflection of the game's themes. The necromorphs cannot be individually categorized because they are not one being. Isaac Clarke's fight is one against conformity, against assimilation into the collective. Horror in this instance is delivered through violence on our form, torn apart then repurposed for further violence. Nobody owns the body of a deceased. A duty of care is granted to the executor, and cultures throughout antiquity have mutually agreed that if there was ever a time to grant respect to flesh, it is to the flesh of the dead. To the entity that blockades our mission, our dead are granted no grace. Ritual and mourning are devoid as these things scuttle through vents and bear down on Isaac. The central antagonist of Dead Space is the Marker, an alien monolith worshipped by the Church of Unitology. The Church believes that the Marker is a monument that will allow mankind to shed the shackles of individualism, to be unified into a collective afterlife. But of course, religious fanaticism does not lead them to salvation. The Marker infects the minds of those in proximity and drives others to make moves towards its machinations. The crave for collectivism is the philosophy that must be rebelled against. Isaac Clarke is a lone man fighting through a ship of the dead in a bid for survival, not just of his physical form, but also his self-identity. The deaths we see on Failure, each more gruesome than the last, are just the beginning of Isaac's suffering. Lacerated, torn and beheaded, Isaac becomes yet another tool of the Marker. He has no use for these limbs now, so the Marker will find use. Who someone is arguably dies with them. They live on in memory, but their personality, ambitions, and consciousness are gone. The idea of the mind after death is obviously well philosophized, but the agreement is that you, yourself, no longer inhabit your body. The Marker takes the opportunity, when soul and mind are no more, to take the last piece of your material existence and reshape you into a part of itself. A part that is indistinguishable from the rest. A part that is not you. The Marker has robbed you of your consciousness and your shape and form. Dead Space uses body horror as a reflection of the death of self. The necromorphs taunt us, telling Isaac that our bodies mean nothing. The hook to the game is dismemberment. Necromorphs are killed only through separating their arms and legs, the things they use to kill, from their bodies. The gameplay mechanics are ludonarratively harmonious, as the only way for Isaac to quell the other that is reshaping the physical forms of his people is to dismantle the bodies of his aggressors. To us and Isaac, the necromorphs have been twisted and changed so drastically that remorse for them, as our plasma cutter breaks them down, does not exist. Body horror in Dead Space exists to such a point that even we fail to recognize who these people were. The tragedy of the game is that in the process of the Marker consuming the self-identity of the crew, even our perceptions of them have changed. Conformity in Dead Space is presented through monstrous transformation. Play Dead's Inside illustrates conformity in an equally unsettling manner, centering on the insipid rather than abomination, for the most part. In Inside, you wear a red shirt, seemingly innocuous, but your attire distinguishes you from the drab and clinical garb of every other humanoid in the game. The people of the game generally fall into two categories: antagonists and husks. We don't know anything of the world when the game starts. The boy emerges from the left side of the screen, crawling through a hole in the environment, and walks right. The first beings we encounter are adults searching in the dark with flashlights, and it becomes immediately evident that they are looking for you. Being caught by a person or attack dog results in failure, and you are as often forced to respawn due to being restrained than outright killed. The game is a loose narrative with no dialogue, so the story must be inferred, but the first thing we learn is that for some reason, your freedom is a threat to these people. As you journey further east, things become a little stranger. Dogs and men pursue you, but then you see something else. The shape of a person, but they are lethargic and unaware. These beings are referred to as albinos in the game's soundtrack. Uncertain if they were ever mindful people, they are now tools for the mission of some unknown entity. We see wires leading to consoles and strange devices used to command them, and we attach ourselves to one, and forcibly impart our will onto this thing. And it is as natural as moving our own body. These husks are slaves, completely willless. Midway through the game, we find ourselves in a marching line with the albinos. Here we see how much this world scrutinizes conformity. A mechanical lens watches our every movement, blinking rapidly at any deviation as we step, jump, and twist in time with 100 things that look the same. We use the mass of albinos to further our goals. We command flesh to push boxes or carry us where we need, like they are tools for manual handling. Us as players may draw discomfort in their use, but the boy, often animated fluidly and organically, marches these puppets with a rigidity that borders on militaristic. The only emotion we really see the boy express is fear, for which he has every reason to feel. But we never see him remorseful or even contemplative. There is a distinct lack of curiosity as he uses his environment, complete with bodies, to evade capture. It becomes clear in the latter third of the game that the environment we navigate is a lab testing the effects of mind control. The center of these experiments, of all of their testing, is suspended in this tank. Inside is an amorphous blob of flesh and limb attached to machinery. We, seemingly through empathy, begin detaching the plugs for the being known as the huddle. But before we can jig the final node free, we are consumed by it. We struggle for freedom instinctively, but we are inevitably absorbed into the mass of pulsating tissue. The huddle barrels through the facility, accompanied by a cacophony of terror and shattered glass, until it gets the opportunity to lie still in the sun. The huddle seems to be the source of the supernatural mind control central to the gameplay. The absence of consciousness of the albinos is open realty for the huddle. Like the marker, it uses the empty bodies of humanoids to reach its goals. But whereas the Church of Unitology seemingly worships an ethereal idea of collectivism, the scientists of Inside have found a physical manifestation of collective consciousness, one that hungrily stole our body when it was no longer of use. There are many theories surrounding the game. As I said, the narrative is pretty loose. But one that I take as fact is that we, as the red-shirted boy, were always part of the collective. The reason I believe this is not due to the behavior of NPCs that for some reason want to stop the boy more than anything else, but in the gameplay mechanics, in who we control. For most of the game we are the boy, but once he is subsumed into limb and sinew, we control the huddle. Our decisions dictate how aggressively we trample and crush. It's us that instills terror in the technicians, and it's us that tumbles down the hill to our deserved rest. The damage the huddle achieves, this is what the dogs and men were trying to stop when they shot dead a fleeing child. They knew then that we were not ourselves. We wear the red shirt to express our otherness, but the grace of being one oneself, belongs to them. Not to the boy, and not to the huddle. We have never had an identity to call our own. We've always been part of a greater whole. In 1986, David Cronenberg directed a remake of The Fly. It tells the story of Seth Brundle, a reclusive but brilliant scientist that is on the cusp of creating a teleportation device. Seth Brundle is approached by Ronnie Quaife, a journalist who aims to document his breakthrough, and at the time of their first meeting, Seth has not mastered the transportation of living tissue. He tests the device on a baboon. The confused animal is deconstructed into its molecules, unaware. It disappears in one pod, and when it is reassembled, it is assembled into a mass of blood and gore. To the unsuspecting animal, scientific endeavour strips it of life and body in an instant. But Brundle has a breakthrough. In an epiphany, he conjures the solution to transporting living matter. He tests the pod on a much luckier baboon, and then, because it is a sci-fi movie, he uses himself as the subject of an experiment. He enters the transportation pod, unaware that a lone housefly has found its way into the chamber with him. And the test is a success. He emerges from the chamber shrouded in mist, but the fly is gone. He didn't even know it was there. And this is where the plot of the movie really begins. We learn that the fly's DNA has been commingled with that of Seth Brundle's. He runs tests to see if this will have any adverse effects, but naturally this is uncharted territory. The scientist starts to change. Slowly by slowly, he loses his humane appearance. His teeth fall out, his flesh begins to bubble, and his digestive system takes on the properties of the housefly. Being the scientist he is, he documents and charts his change, creating video diaries to track his disintegrating flesh and mind. The change in his body is obvious, but most disconcerting is his identity. His loss of teeth and skin are mere vanity compared to his loss of his personhood. His DNA is altered, and to him, he is no longer Seth Brundle. He starts to refer to himself as Brundlefly. The merging of his DNA with the bugs seems to be warping not only his biology, but his sanity too. He becomes violent and mad, as his humanity is being shed and discarded. His scientific endeavours drive him to study the fly within him, but he has a necessity to cling to his humanity. His plan to save the human in him is not to expunge the fly from Brundlefly, but to dilute it. His thesis is that if he were a being that was more human than fly, then perhaps he could be saved. And this is what he wants to do. He wants to incorporate himself, Ronnie, and their unborn child into a monstrous family unit to stave off his transformation into a being that this time is more human than fly. The creation of Brundlefly is a discarding of the identities both of the fly and Seth Brundle. The scientist's body is no longer his. The scarring and freckles that he once held so dear are gone. A thing that is non-human, a thing that is not us, has stolen Seth Brundle from the world. The climax of the film occurs when Ronnie, fighting for her survival, struggles and fights against Brundlefly. Wet muscle slides from his body, and the facade of humanity exchanged for the final amalgamation of man and bug. He sees himself. He sees what he's become. And he sees what he is doing. To himself. And to Ronnie. In a final moment, he pulls the barrel of a shotgun to his head, and wordlessly begs for Ronnie to pull the trigger. Seth Brundle dies in the transportation pod long before the first blisters appeared. This moment, his final moment, was a resurrection. Dead Space and Inside use collectivism and the will of the many as their threats to the self. They use the alien, otherworldly, or ambiguous to represent a change within us. The Fly instead uses something simple, banal and earthly, to illustrate the threat to our mind, body, and soul. Earthly or alien, these stories use the non-human to reflect the loss of personhood. This man not only lost his body and identity to a thing so insignificant, but the death of his humanity also drove him to harm the mother of his child. The phrase violence begets violence here is terribly applicable, as the loss of the ownership of his body led him to see such a terrible solution, one in which the unification of selves, so commonly a metaphor in romantic ceremony, was used in betrayal. Together is a film by Michael Shanks, in which Dave Franco and Alison Brie play Tim and Millie, a couple that are taking a step in their relationship and moving to the country. Millie is a teacher, and Tim is an aspiring musician. Their dynamic is strained. Tim carries a lot of emotional trauma, and Millie is supportive to the point of reliance. The film deals with body horror, but this couple's relationship is about codependence. Codependence is often misattributed to a mutual exchange, to a reliance of two people to prop each other up, but the reality of this dysfunction is that a codependent couple is most often made up of a giver and a taker. Often the needs of one become so great that they cannot tackle them alone. The giver in the relationship offers them support, emotional or physical, and they become so reliant that they cannot be separated from the unit of the relationship. This is the dynamic of Tim and Millie's romance. Tim is in desperate need of emotional support, and more than anything, she just wants some breathing room. The claustrophobia of their living situation blends into horrific literality when they stumble upon the wreckage of a dilapidated church and become cursed. Not cursed to misfortune or violent affliction, but cursed in attraction. The dependence of the young man becomes one akin to addiction. Physical distance brings out sweat and panic when he cannot be in the presence of his loved one. And then, the strange thing starts to happen. When they touch, they start to blend. Their skin melts together, and pulling themselves to solitude is as painful as one can imagine as they tear their mutual flesh apart. Physical separation becomes impossible, as not only is Tim psychologically drawn to Millie, but an otherworldly force akin to poltergeist pulls them together through doors, taking no hesitation against the nails that cling to hardwood floors. Tim and Millie are losing themselves. They struggle and fight, doing all they can to remain two people. But restraint and power tools can only go so far to kill love. It's revealed that the church that they stumbled into was one of occult ritualism, and they had accidentally inserted themselves into the most beautiful of ceremonies: marriage. The curse placed on them is meant to be one of two lovers consensually giving up their identity. The two literally become one, and a being emerges from the ritual that is wholly new. Two names, two faces die, so that they can really, truly be together. But Tim and Millie don't want this. Tim yearns for Millie. His complete lack of independence drives her to near hatred at points. She does care for him, and there is value in him needing her, but he needs her so much. It's exhausting, and he takes and takes. His comfort bears the price of her happiness, and there's no reason these people should be together. As stated, the ceremony of marriage is meant to be one of celebration, and to the parish of this lost church it is. The vehicle for shock and shielded eyes and together is not necessarily the curse. It is the couple's awareness that they do not belong together. In one scene, as the amalgamation begins to take place, Millie is forced to use a reciprocating saw to render themselves as two separate beings. They bear identical wounds as a reminder that their personhood is forfeit to the codependence that enshrouds their romance. Throughout the film, they struggle to remain themselves, both physically and metaphysically. Once again, we are presented with protagonists changing, but this time, the entity that aims to warp and alter is not of alien origin. Their limbs are not carved into blades or repurposed for flight and evasion. Tim and Millie's merging flesh is horrific, but there is no otherworldly entity to change into. No marker or facehugger, no fly or huddle. Together illustrates that one can lose themselves in a manner that is wholly familiar. We don't need aliens, insects, or this to lose our identity. Individuality can die, even in the most inconsequential of ways. Our bodies are us. Our personality, emotions, wants, fears, attractions, and hopes need a vessel to house them. Experiences are funneled through neurons, transmitters, and chemistry to inform us of the world around us and shape our being in a handshake of flesh and mind. It's no surprise that we create stories centered on changing bodies. The idea of the unknown entering into our world is commonplace, and our fear of the alien is reflective in our innate desire to protect the familiar, to protect what is ours. And there is nothing that belongs to us more than our identity. Who we are is the one constant in lived experience, as the world and others change so easily in manners we cannot fully understand. To have ourselves change without our control is an invasion. Dead Space and Inside both use their narratives to explore the theft of form and the loss of identity to a hive mind, to a groupthink that is grander, larger than we are, making us feel insignificant in our singular wants and desires. But body horror is a reflection of robbed identity. It does not exclusively belong to antagonists of the many. There is an equal terror in losing ourselves to just one other, one we may love or despise. The horror of these stories are not centered on the blood, bones, and organs that warp and shift. Our changing bodies are not the thing we really feel. They're unsettling, sure, but the true terror, beyond aliens, monoliths, or mad science, when we strip away the gore and the things that kill, what remains is the fear that we may change. That one day we could wake up, and we might not be ourselves.